The reason for me, I'll give a brief introduction regarding my book. It's called Peace and Reconciliation in International Islamic Law. And what was the context and the modus operandi for me kind of going in this endeavor? So first and foremost, when you look around the world today, you see many conflict theaters around the world, places such as Syria, such as the Yemen, which have been going on for many years. Although we have seen recent changes, in the last couple of weeks regarding some of those theaters. But internationally, analysts would call these places as frozen wars or never-ending wars, as in these have been going on for such a long time, and there doesn't seem to be a light at the end of the tunnel in terms of finding a just resolution or outcome for these. So this got me thinking in terms of, especially when you look at some of the conflict theaters which my book touches on, which is Afghanistan, Kashmir and the Palestine-Israel situation, that reverberating in these conflicts is also Islamic paradigms, Islamic norms, Islamic law aspects that are always, simmering either as an undertone or sometimes also as an overtone in these theaters. So what I wanted to do in terms of my kind of endeavor as part of this exercise was to kind of analyze, first and foremost, what are the rules in international law that deal with peace and reconciliation. So that's what the first chapter of my book looks into. So, I mean, most international observers will be familiar with the concepts around conciliation, arbitration, and even things like self-defense, which is there in international law, which is when this is activated. Article 51, preemptive strikes is something which has been used in international law. We saw that in situations such as places like in Iraq, which take place in WMD. So this is something with international law kind of canopy exists. And we also have international humanitarian law that deals with humanitarian principles. And these are all ethics and norms which the first chapter of my book touches on in terms of the rules that are there from an international perspective. The second chapter of my book focuses more so on what are the rules that are there, which is the peace and reconciliation in Islamic law. And I guess this is something, what triggered me to do so is that a lot of the time when the name Islam is mentioned in the public sphere, a lot of the country, you tend to get a lot of distorted understanding. A lot of time, obviously, you get the slogans or, that are used to kind of maybe depict what Islam is about. But, those who understand the depth of the tradition will be able to explain to you that there's a whole modus and tools and operations and principles that are there that can be used. So what this chapter does is, first and foremost, it talks about, what are the sources in Islamic law that can be used for dispute resolution and peace and reconciliation. So first and foremost, you have the revelatory text, which is the Quran. Then you have the methodology to the practices of the Prophet Muhammad, which is the final messenger of God. So these are the sayings and the teachings. But then there's a jurisprudential arm of it, which are the schools of law. So you have, the schools of Imam Abu Hanifa, Maliki, Shafi, and Imam bin Hanbal. Then even people in Shia theology, you have Imam Jafar Sadiq. So you can really go into it quite in-depth, mechanisms to deal with disputes from that perspective. So within the Islamic system, we have principles of diplomacy. They talked about how diplomacy should take place, the ethics of diplomacy. You have the issues around interlocutors into the peace and reconciliation, in terms of when they're dealing with the disputes. What are the mechanisms to deal with the disputes? So to give you an example, one of the things in Islamic law, which is quite prevalent, is about the principle of restorative justice. So in international law, you may have situations where it's about a win-lose scenario, retributive justice in terms of, somebody's attacked me, I need to go and attack them back as a form of vengeance and a revenge. But in Islamic law, the principle of healing and reconciliation is also there. So this is something which is just kind of one example, which my kind of book touches on. And what comes out forward also when it comes to Islamic law is what they call maqasid al-Sharia. So the purpose of Sharia law, in essence, is the protection of life, intellect, lineage, dignity, property. So these are kind of the sacrosanct tenets that exist as a tenet. So then when you look at international law and look at the synergies, you find, wait a minute, we have human rights law that talks about the same principle, the right to life, the right to education, the freedom of expression, freedom of conscience. So there's a lot of synergies that all of a sudden you start to find within the parameters of the two different mellows that exist. So this was something which first was more kind of an intellectual endeavor, which stimulated me to to go and explore. But then obviously, what the next question you ask yourself is, this is all very well, me and my kind of idealized world, trying to think about all these utopian, wonderful similarities and differences, but there's the real world out there. There's conflicts taking place, and how would these principles work in practice? So that was the question. So when I looked at the similarities and differences, I looked at the scenarios that I chose as a kind of test case, was the situation in Afghanistan, Palestine-Israel, and Kashmir. So starting off with Afghanistan, the first thing you ask yourself is that, Islamic law has a big role to play. It's a Muslim majority country. The system within there, although multiple administrations have come and gone, we had Taliban, at the beginning, and I got 2.0, another version has come about. But the first question that arises is the international discourse is that the depiction of Islam, the way that Islam is utilized in practice within that country, is it in consonant with the core tenets in the tradition, as the normative principle that most faith-based actors would agree to? And the kind of overwhelming response you would get on the whole is that that's not the case, because there's a lot of dichotomies and differentiations. One of the classic examples is the principle of the right to education, which international law talks about the right to education. Islamic law talks about the right to education, the cradle to the grave principle. But for some apparent reason, the Taliban seem to be not adhering to this principle for the right to education for girls. This is the classic example where a check and balance, which I will touch on later on in my talk, can come into play. But then the other thing which happens in Afghanistan is you have the jirga system, which are in the Sharia law, what we call these are urf, which are like customary norms that are part and parcel of the country. So you ask yourself that when you have these actors that are engaged in conflict in places like Afghanistan for many years, and you are trying to broker a resolution. So now you put on the hat of a diplomat, you put on the hat of interlocutor. You are the US who have been in there for many years and obviously recently withdrew in 2021, and all the other different stakeholders that engage. The premise which I make is from an Islamic law and jurisprudential perspective is that if those diplomats and interlocutors are well versed in the nuances of the Islamic tradition, when they are engaging in the brokering of a dispute, I feel that as a facilitative tool that can help a speedier resolution to the conflict, as opposed to someone who comes in there blind, has no understanding of the contextual nuances of that society, the cultural norms and the traditions. So that is the point I make in terms of where an Islamic law paradigm, Islamic law peace and reconciliation principles can help the brokering of a dispute. So let's take a look at this in practice. In the last couple of years, we had the situation in Doha. There've been negotiations with, taking place in Qatar with representatives from the Taliban, and also then obviously you got other offshoots of it within Afghanistan itself that also at play. And then the other question that arises in this dichotomy is that at one stage you have non-state actors, then all of a sudden they're becoming state actors. So for many a time, the Taliban were not ruling in Afghanistan, but all of a sudden now they've got for whatever the way how they got into power, they now are the administration in power. So as an international organization, a lot of countries have decided we're not going to recognize them diplomatically, but will that help in terms of trying to find a brokerage or a resolution to that? Or what I advocate is that in terms of the model is that whether we like it or not, unfortunately, sometimes you have to dialogue and discourse with people you don't like at the table. That is the only way you're going to get a resolution. So this is something where, again, the point I make is that when you are negotiating with these representatives from the Taliban, people who are versed in the tradition of Islamic law and the ethics, they can then help, I feel, that, especially as a check and balance, and they are using tools to justify even religiosity as a justification of what they're doing, then people of authority can then use that as a check and balance. And I'll elaborate more on what I mean by that in a short while. Then if we take the situation in Kashmir, the princely state of Kashmir, that's been a conflict since the time of partition between two neighboring countries of India and Pakistan. That's been going on for a long time. And within international law, you have obviously the principle of the right to self-determination, the right to plebiscite that was advocated for the people of Kashmir, which has not been utilized to this date. In recent years, we've had situation that has changed with the Modi administration, the Article 35A and 370, whereby what has happened there is obviously this is a princely state where there were a lot of rights that were given to Kashmiris, but all of a sudden those property rights, human rights have been taken away, and that's led to more an escalation of tensions in that region, in what is classed as Indian occupied Kashmir. So what I look at in this conflict is that, again, the international law paradigms and legal structures are there to deal with brokering dispute resolutions here. Again, do you look at it as a bilateral model, or do you bring in interlocutors? We've recently seen in places such as some of the conflicts that we've just been talking about in terms of Arab and Iran reconciliation, which people thought would never happen. So China's reconciliation there as a role. So this is where interlocutors come in. So with the situation in Kashmir, what the model which I look at is, obviously, when I look at Islamic and international law, what you have is people from different denominations. They're not the only representatives that exist. You have people from the Christian community, you have people from the Sikh community, and other minority groups too that are all, key players in this situation. So in my book, what I explore is that when you're using just an Islamic and international model in that situation, it ain't going to work. And what you need is, what the principle I use is called theodiplomacy. And this is where you have representatives from the major faith traditions. From Jami al-Azhar, you have the sheikhs from Jami al-Azhar, from the Vatican, the papal representatives, the bishops, the Anglicans, the gurus and the shayukh and the sheikhs. And what they will be able to do is then, as a body, they can act as a check and balance and as a brokerage tool here into the facilitating a reconciliation model. So what I mean by that is that when the high-rise ethics and principles in faith traditions from a normative perspective, you'll find there's a whole host of literature that inclines towards peace and reconciliation. That is the kind of direction of travel that exists. So when you have these actors that are coming forward and using the tools of religiosity, so we've taken the situation in India right now. We have the RSS, the Hindutva, people use the term Hindu nationalism. I sometimes agree with that terminology. I rather prefer to using the word pseudo-Hindu, Hindu organizations, or the Hindutva ideology, because the essence I wish to make is that the normative traditions of these faith principles, they would not agree with what is taking place on a political level in terms of what on the auspices of the Hindutva and what they're doing. And what I look at in terms of analysis in my book is, if you look at the situation, what happened with Daesh in Syria, again, the term Islam is used. They use Islamic State as a justification for what they're doing. But when you speak to the mainstream representatives of these faith traditions, they will say, this has got nothing to do with Islam in terms of what they're trying to create, this utopian paradigm, this, is kind of nihilistic state that's been created. But unfortunately, people have still fallen foul and seem to, buy that idea for whatever reason. This is where obviously politics, military engagements, geopolitics, all that kind of comes into that mixture in terms of why that takes place. So coming back to the situation in Kashmir, what such a body can do is act as a check and balance. So when the Hindutva are doing what they're doing, on the auspices of religiosity, the senior representative from the Hindu faith tradition, as part of the body, which I will touch on towards the end, in terms of this diplomacy model, what that does is it acts as a check. It says, leader of so-and-so, representing Hindutva, what is your justification? What is your theological grounding as to why you're doing what you're doing? To justify the acts that you're doing in terms of trying to take over a whole piece of land on the basis of its ideology. The same principle applies to Daesh. That when they were doing what they were doing, what is the modus operandi? Where is the justification? Because there's nothing in history just that, from a Islamic lexical perspective and a traditional perspective, that justifies what they're doing. So then that will act as a check. And then the kind of reprimand at the international level, the international community that they will get, will hopefully act as a check to say, not only for the protagonist, but other susceptible people who may think that this is a wise thing to do. So that's the principle I like to explore. Moving on to the situation in Palestine-Israel, this is again one of those unending, conflicts that has been going on for many years. And one thing which, obviously, when you look at the paradigms of international Islamic law, what you realize is this essence around sovereign equality, or the sovereign equality of states or the parties that are engaged in the conflict. Is there a stable balance? So what you find when you look at this situation in the Palestine-Israel situation is that there is an imbalance in terms of the situation, whereas the Palestinians over the peace seem to be the ones that seem to be the most oppressed, as opposed to the other party. This is something Al-Gindi, written a book called The Blind Spot, touches on in the book, and I kind of quote him in my book, if I can quickly find the quote. So he talks about on page 88, in terms of, he says, this blindness to the unequal power dynamic between the Palestinians and Israel and the internal politics of both sides has critically hampered the ability of the US to serve as an effective peace broker. So this is obviously his analysis as a blind spot. And I think what he primarily gets at is this imbalance of power. And if you really want to have a situation whereby you want to have a resolution, then clearly one of the premises is that there's a equality there. But then coming back to my model, in terms of if I was to use the international Islamic law paradigm, whereas Islamic law is obviously plays a role in Palestine and Israel today, but a lot of the time it's in the personal law, personal affairs, rather than in the kind of governing aspect of the state. But what we have there is the major Abrahamic faith traditions, the Muslims, the Jews, the Christians, and many more. So this is where, again, when I looked at it in my book, what you realize is that the model which I'm advocating would not work here, in the sense that what you need is something more out of the box analysis to broker a resolution. And this is where the high-rise principles of international law, the high-rise principles of faith come in and can play a role. This is where one of the interlocutors who are into it, John-Paul Kutab, talks about, and he says, principles of justice, principles of fairness, principles of rights, or discourses. These are the principles that will help in bringing about a peaceful resolution to this conflict. And obviously, intertwined in that, we have the two-state solution paradigm that has been used for many years in terms of Washington D.C. as the solution. But when interlocutors such as John Kutab, he talks about maybe the idea of maybe a one-state solution, but based on principle of equality, based on principle of citizenship and rights orientation for the people there. So that all of a sudden will then alleviate that balance, the imbalance of power dynamic, which Al-Gindi talks about, to address this conflict. So in the situation of Palestine and Israel, the diplomatic model is something which I feel, again, can play a role. And where that plays a role as a facilitative tool is in this body, you'll have senior clergy, senior rabbis, senior sheikhs, senior muftis, senior bishops from the different faith traditions. So when you have these ultra-right organizations, such as sadly what we've been seeing just in the last few weeks, secular organizations doing what they're doing, and they will again use sometimes real politics. On other occasions, they use the tools of religion to justify what they're doing. Such a body will act as a check to such individuals and say, wait a minute, this is what you're doing is based on your self-proclaimed power. This is the normal political dynamics of what you're doing. And on occasion, it's going more than that, in terms of innocent people are losing their lives, and the destruction and devastation that causes is cataclysmic. And this is where the body that I recommend will act as a check. And then what that will do is maybe make such actors think twice, in terms of the backlash that will get internationally from the media by doing such things. So, for example, within the Palestinian situation, the compound of Masjid al-Aqsa, they are, obviously the custodians. It's being managed by Jordan, one of the custodians, but there are religious rights and laws that exist into the who can pray, at what time, and so forth. A lot of those have been violated by the secular groups into what they've been doing. And again, this is at odds with international law, at odds with religious ethics and religious tenets. And this is where I think, again, that check aspect and check and balance could play a role. So looking at these different theaters of conflict, what I also then explore is that, these are the different paradigms that we have. Then at the international level, such as the United Nations, you have, supranational bodies, the European Commission, you have the United Nations, you have the United Nations Security Council, and how that from foreign policy, international relations dynamic, changes. Obviously, you've got Russia, who's I think leading at the moment as part of the P5 or P6. So what I then advocate is an International Peace and Reconciliation Council Commission. And what that will have is representatives from the theological different groups, which I've just been alluding to, as a theopolitical, political, diplomatic model, and represented from women, because sometimes often negated, women into the diplomacy and the role that they can play, the soft skills. These are so important also in terms of helping broker conflicts. And obviously you'll have all the senior interlocutors, the diplomats that can all play a role. What that will also need is signatory, the signatories to the United Nations Security Council, other senior countries to sign up to it. That it's not just a talking shop that you just don't take heed of. You have to bind yourself that you will adhere to these principles. And intertwined in that, obviously, my book does touch on is obviously the role of nuclear weapons, sadly, and the threat of nuclear weapons, and what does the international law and international Islamic law would do to touch on those kind of principles from an ethics and a humanity perspective. This is something which is also critical in terms of understanding that. So this Peace and Reconciliation Council would act as a check and balance in conflict theaters around the world. They can be used as a tool, as an aid for interlocutors, for diplomats when they're engaging in conflict, and to help broker these disputes and bring about a speedy resolution. That's something which I advocate in my book as a facilitative tool. And then touching on some of the kind of aspects around the humanitarian norms, the high-rise principles within international law, within faith-based organizations, is around humanity, the sanctity of humanity. And this is something which is pivotal in this discourse. And this is something which my book touches on. One thing, when we look at the differences in terms of the balance of probability from a legal threshold and how the two willows operate. So one of the things we talk about is what is the evidential burden if you are engaging conflict that you would use to justify you intervening in a particular situation. So the notion of preemptive strikes, which has been used in international, states have used it and justified it through international law to do what they're doing. In international Islamic law, the threshold will probably be a lot more higher, because before you are able to attack somebody deemed to be the enemy, the evidential burden has to be certain. And in Islam, the term is called yaqeen, certainty. And if you are making a decision based on evidence which is lackluster, then you would not engage in that preemptive strike. You would hold fire. And this is one of the key differences you can explore as you start looking into this. And then again, these same parameters, when it comes to countries about to engage in a conflict, can be used for any potential individual who's thinking about doing anything along those lines as a check and balance. So the WMD situation in Iraq, this is something where that check could work, in terms of what was about to unfold there, and sadly what did unfold in terms of thereafter. So these are some of the kind of tools that I used in my book in terms of recommendations. And the other point which I would also like to talk about is in Islamic law, there's the principle of oaths. And so the oaths that you make, as obviously when you have a truce, like the Truce and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, there are certain things that you do, so the decommissioning of arms that took place, the principle of people confessing that these are the crimes and misdemeanors we've done over the peace, but now we're going to mend our ways, and that as a reconciliation tool, and something which I already alluded to, the principle of restorative justice, and the principle of healing and moving on to a new chapter in terms of the conflict transformation and peacekeeping. This is also pivotal, which my book touches on as part of the discourse. And I think finally, what I would mention is that when I've done this endeavor, and looked at, analyzed this in my book, is that by no means am I saying these are, absolutist paradigms. And this is which situations such as Palestine-Israel allude to, that an absolutist model doesn't work. You have to have agility, you have to have tact, diplomacy, flexibility, and be able to use these tools as a lever, as a leverage, when you feel the contextual circumstances justify that and would resonate and have an impact in those situations. So it's by no means it's a top-down vertical approach that you try to bulldozer this into an implementation. That is not the case. It's using it with wisdom and and in a proportionate manner. And this is something which obviously international law also talks about, the principle of proportionality, the responsibility to protect. These are all discourses which Islamic law would also talk about. And finally, just some of the ethics of war. The often kind of misconstrued word of jihad is, sometimes think about Islam and they use jihad. Is all the kind of permutations start to ticker around that. But what I try to cover in my book is, and obviously senior people who have of war studies such as Professor Joel Hayward also kind of chime into this, is that he uses term, he goes that the notion of jihad is pretty much like an individual, and lexically means struggle. Somebody putting effort to do something better, to improve their life. Going on an educational endeavor means in jihad, trying to increase your knowledge, kind of thing. But he always gets misconstrued as a tool for violence and brutality and so forth. And what I try to do is that try to break that down in my book in terms of, from a classical perspective, that who has the authority to create, to actually announce that you are now able to intervene in another state, and the authority for that is the state, is the leadership of the state. So no individual on their own volition can pick up the backpack and say, okay, I'm off to go on a quote unquote holy jihad or whatever. It doesn't work like that. And again, this is where the body which I'm advocating can act as a check and a balance in those situations. And then lexically, the ethics of war, in terms of how you deal with combatants, non-combatants, the timings of war, the prisoners of war, how you deal with them. These are all ethics and rules and norms that exist not only in international law, but Islamic law. The dignity of the dead. How do you deal with people who need to be buried, giving a timely burial? These are ethics of principles of faith that come into play there. And having those, how do you deal with prisoners of war? How do you treat them? Islamic law provides guidance in that, as does international law. So these are humane principles that can be used to help in the facilitative process of brokering peace and reconciliation in conflict theaters around the world. And so I think if I can just finally conclude in terms of the description I give of what theodiplomacy is in my book, it's on page 102. It says theodiplomacy is an approach wherein the interlocutors and advisors of the parties to a situation of conflict have religious literacy, appreciation and understanding of the contextual sensitivities of the conflict to help facilitate a pathway towards peace and reconciliation. So I think the key word that comes out there is, religious literacy, faith literacy. And often a lot of the interlocutors in today's conflicts, don't seem to have that. And rather than helping the discourse, it tends to cause more problems and friction than the pathway towards peace. So I'll stop there, and thank you very much.
Yes, thanks for this informative presentation. I think it's very much topical, and exactly because of the rising sort of like actors beyond sort of this state entities. I think international law needs to address also non-state entities, and it's becoming even more challenging vis-a-vis the fact that apparently it's not looking at collectivities but just individuals. So I think it is a moment of truth, and that the international law needs really to face its own sort of like its own sort of trajectory. And I mean, I think the war crimes that ISIS committed, and within all this sort of similar context, it's something that and obviously Germany's stance vis-a-vis the Yazidi also genocide, it's opening a new chapter of international law that it will be very interested in the coming years. And it's even more interesting that regional examples, regional events are giving us this sort of informed debate vis-a-vis the theory. I think it's also very important to be noted. Thank you very much. And straight away, I'm coming to you, Andrea. Thanks for your presence here today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks to Biza, to Marianna, and Kaleem, of course, for this really interesting, rich presentation. I just want to start by saying that like hats off to Kaleem, because you really haven't chosen the easy problems, have you? so it's I think it's credit to the efforts that you're trying to that you've undertaken, that you don't shy away from dealing with the serious issues, the core issues that are some of the core issues that are kind of in terms of conflict resolution, endurance of conflict, and so on, that there are today. I have a lot of questions, but what I'll do is I'll try and maybe present 3, 4, or 5. Oh, I shall time myself. There we go. I'll try and present 3 or 4, and then hopefully that helps us have a rich conversation. So my first question, or maybe it's a set of questions, typical academic, is that, so if my understanding of your project is that your endeavor is to try and produce a kind of politically neutral framework that might provide a kind of terra franca, neutral ground for conflict resolution. So the question that immediately arises, well, there are several. One is whether you can clarify whether you intend that as a negotiation framework and or a framework in international law. But the question that first struck me was, from the point of view of a non-expert in Islamic jurisprudence in particular, what's the likelihood that a framework like the one that you suggest can be taken up in the first place, in the sense that it's the roots themselves, given a whole series of issues, Orientalism in Western perceptions, for example, the roots, broadly speaking, in principles of Islamic theology and jurisprudence might in themselves be perceived as kind of non-neutral, or, for example, for, say, Muslim majority country or Muslim soi-disant Islamic actors, etc., they might be symbolically problematic, right? So, for example, if you think about, I don't know, conflicts that identitarian Christian nationalists might be involved with, or that might be an issue. But also, for example, you were talking about some Islamic, again, soi-disant Islamic actors, or governments from Muslim majority countries, say, for example, Saudis, or indeed Israel in relation to the Palestine question. You know, how do you deal with the, strictly speaking, symbolic dimension of the roots of the framework that you invoke itself? Might those themselves be a problem in various, in the way that they're perceived by various actors? Now, the obvious, we were talking about this yesterday. You know, the obvious, one of the obvious objections is, well, who says that the international public law framework that we're using now is anything, you know, approaching, you know, culturally or religiously neutral? The roots of the international public law system, such as they are, have obvious, you know, an obvious genealogy in a certain interpretation of, let's call it Christian Western thinking. But that being said, you know, so in some ways it's embedded in a Christian tradition, but at the same time, the practical problems don't go away. So I just wonder, you know, how you deal with those. And in particular, for example, again, with the question of the uptake, of the acceptability, of the metabolization of the framework as a negotiation framework or as a legal, strictly speaking, legal framework, you know, is the risk, or how do you deal with the risk that the roots of that framework might themselves lead to the politicization? So, for example, is there a risk that the debate gets shifted to who or what constitutes a legitimate representative of or interpretation of a religious or cultural tradition. So those are kind of like, those are my big questions, or kind of questions of principle, that I think for a person outside of these debates would be, oops, sorry, my earpiece just fell out, would be important. But then there's a comparative question. So I'll just list them if you want. Do you want, by the way, do you want to proceed this way, or do you want to take the first question first?
I'm happy to take the first, if that's okay. And then
yes, okay, absolutely.
So thank you very much for the question. The points you have alluded to are addressed in my book. And one of the points I make is, yes, there's theo-diplomacy, but also talk about theo-neutral diplomacy. And it's about creating that neutral paradigm. And then one of the questions I look into is this question of authority. So take, for example, the situation of the Taliban. I'm recommending this body as a Peace and Reconciliation Council as a check and balance. They're going to say, okay, that's all very well, but we don't recognize you as an authority. We will still continue on our merry ways, doing what we're doing, and and proceed on that regard. But the point I wish to make is that when these organizations, be it state or non-state actors, are doing what they're doing on the auspices of religiosity, because a lot of the time this is what they do. They're saying that we do, our faith says this, blah blah blah. This is what we're doing here. Well, when you got senior representatives who are recognized authorities, globally, and that are sitting on this council, the Reconciliation Council, and then they say, so and so X, leader so and so, what you're saying has got nothing to do with, is not in tandem with the tradition that you proclaim to represent, then that will act as a check. In today's global media age that we live in, where news flashes around in seconds and all that kind of stuff, at least it will make them think twice before they even decide to do the next step. So that's the point I'm making. And then for sometimes, on certain occasions, some of these bodies may even have representatives who they do respect as an authority. And all of them, again, so if somebody who's today ended up in political power in Afghanistan and his leader is actually part of the body, and he's saying, actually, you may be doing this political act today for what you think is justifiable, but if you're doing on the auspices of tenant X, Y, and Z, there's no justification in that. So that's how that that principle works in practice. So it's something which I did explore in my book, and I think this is something which is critical, is that principle of authority that is there. And on a bit of a sign point, which I also into the Peace and Reconciliation Council, which is maybe something a bit more softer in terms of as a tool. Obviously, you have the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals that also have incorporated in their principles of right to education, gender equality, and working towards peace, just societies. And in that kind of corpus, that would also feature there. In terms of that kind of the paradigms, the tools that are there at the disposal of the check for to counter these trends. But to answer your question, that's why when I've been looking into this, and from a state apparatus perspective, and also as a negotiating tool, I feel this model can apply in both situations, because the diplomats are there at the ready when they need to be summoned, and the expertise and the skill sets that can be used in these situations, and when states are looking to do certain acts, if those individuals, the state representatives, decide to confer or seek the council, that can act as a check. And then in the negotiation process, the track 2 diplomacy, etc., it's got a major role to play. And I think even if you're going to say this, it's got no role to play, I think you're missing a trick. That the tool should be there as an option for you to bring that at the ready to the table and have these people ready to help you in the dispute resolution process. That's the point I want to make here.